My name's Jacob Furedi. I am a trainee reporter at the Daily Mail, which is somewhat, pertinent to this debate. No wonder. So welcome to What is Fascism? This is the final debate in a strand looking at a crisis of political language, something which I found very interesting personally. So you look back to 1932 when Mussolini was writing. He had a very clear and distinct idea of what fascism was. He put forward a manifesto almost, talking about what fascism was. So he talked about how he contrasted it with Marxian socialism and a number of other things. Where these days, you could be forgiven for thinking that there's been a second rising of fascism. After the Brexit referendum, we were warned that fascism had returned. After Marine Le Pen almost got elected, we were warned that fascism had returned. The Guardian even ran a fantastic article titled "Beware of Cupcake Fascism." It's pretty clear that fascism is all the rage these days. So what I've done is we've got a fabulous panel here who are kind of leading academics and thinkers who are going to provide a very interesting and historical context to this debate on fascism. I really think it's important that if we're going to try and discuss whether fascism has returned, to return back to basics about what fascism really means. And it's only by doing that we can kind of grasp the situation today. So we've got, as I mentioned, we've got a fairly stellar panel. Who's going to speak first is Professor Kevin Passmore, sitting on my far right, who is the head of history at Cardiff University. He's the author of Fascism, A Very Short Introduction. I'm sure we've all seen the book series. And he's also, retains a particular interest in the Third Republic and the Vichy years. Who's going to speak second is Professor Roger Griffin. He's a professor of modern history at Oxford Brookes. He has a real interest in the history of the South and its impact on history. And his book, titled Fascism, An Introduction to Fascist Studies, will be coming out next March. Thirdly, we have Professor Jane Caplan, who's a Professor Emeritus of Modern European History at the University of Oxford and a visiting professor at Birkbeck at the University of London, who retains a really kind of interesting angle on gender and its kind of role within fascist thought. And then last but not least, on my far left, we have Bruno Waterfield, who's a regular at the Battle of Ideas. He's the Brussels correspondent for The Times, where he's been reporting on European affairs for 15 years, first from Westminster and then from the capital of the European Union. We're going to start with some brief comments. You guys know the drill. We might have a bit of banter on stage and then come straight out to you guys, okay? So get some good questions. Kevin, if you'd like to kick us off.
Well, I'm going to start with an apology because I'm not going to tell you what fascism really was. We often hear that we need to agree terms as a precondition of any meaningful debate, but I think that's not possible, either in routine political debate or in academic work on fascism. This is a public debate, and I think it's worth saying that calling on academics to give a correct definition, I think, is to misconceive actually what academics can and indeed should do or claim to do in politics. And so what I think is more important in obviously the term fascism is a very important term, but we need to think not so much about correct definition, but consequences of its use and meanings that people gave to it. Now, I think we have no problem with understanding with other ideologies that we don't really need fixed definitions. We use terms like socialism or liberalism, knowing that it means different things to different people. I think we probably understand in the Conservative Party, for instance, debates about what it means to be a conservative are actually the stuff of politics. Who truly represents conservative values, Boris Johnson or Ken Clarke? We know that we use such terms, in other words, in knowing that they entail debates. And these debates are not abstract because one can be excluded from a cabinet, for example, for not espousing the correct conservative values. Now, these disputes in the Conservative Party are rarely fatal, but disputes over the meaning of, say, National Socialism could be fatal for members of the movement even, let alone those outside of it. Now, the reason we have greater difficulty in accepting the imprecision of political labels for fascism is because since 1945, as everyone knows, it's been the ultimate term of political abuse. Nobody who calls themselves a fascist is likely to be politically successful, though some people do. So political groups use fascism to discredit their worst enemies. We know, for instance, that Donald Trump is often labelled a fascist, for instance, because of his nationalism and racism. His defenders, of course, won't want to be labelled fascists, So they respond that the real fascism is actually Obamacare because it manipulates big business and undermines free enterprise without actually nationalising it, according to Breitbart News. Now, both sides can actually point to something maybe in the history of fascism that more or less justifies their position. Now, these debates, because of the universally negative connotation of fascism, these debates tend to be more public and tend to be played out in the general press much more than, say, debates about the meaning of socialism or conservatism. Often it's only socialists or conservatives that care about those, but with fascism, it's not the case. Now, it's not surprising, therefore, that those involved in these debates about fascism often turn to academics to settle them. Tell us who the true fascist is. They don't say, you know, or much less rarely do they say, tell us who the true socialist or conservative is. Now, personally, I don't think that academics really can say scientifically who is a fascist and who isn't. They can't settle that argument within parties. And the reason for that is quite simple. Even if we consign ourselves just to those who called themselves fascist in Italy between 1919 and 1945, we find a very diverse range of views. And one historian, Alexander de Grand, who wrote a little book about fascism, just for one example, he identifies, I think, 5 different fascisms. So fascism has been pro-capitalist, sometimes anti-capitalist, sometimes speaks the language of revolution, sometimes order, sometimes nationalism, sometimes Europeanism. It becomes even more diverse if we add to it other regimes or movement that we think to which we think the fascist label might apply, including groups such as Nazis who rejected the label. So, when we're asked, is Donald Trump a fascist? Our answer depends on our definition. Now, definitions usually do show something about fascism. All the work that's been done using definition does. Marxists have revealed much about the relationship between fascism and capitalism. Roger Griffin here has shown much about its revolutionary nationalism. And there's something in all of that. The problem is the claim to have found the definition and to be able to say who is a fascist existentially. All definitions come up against things that don't fit, and they have to use their definition, therefore, to say that the things that don't fit are somehow secondary or less important. And for example, in the case of getting nationalism and Nazism and National Socialism into the same category, you have to play down anti-Semitism, for example, and say it's somehow a secondary consequence. Now, I think disputes like that are actually irresolvable because different sides assume different theoretical starting points. So academics, I think, are no better than anyone else at deciding who the true fascists are. So where does that leave us? I think we need to distinguish between academic research and political debate, and I'm going to do so much more crudely than I would if I had longer. Research is about answering specific questions about how the world has been. Politics is about how the world should be. Academics can understand some of the many things that fascism has been in the past, what fascism has meant to particular people, the definitions they used, and above all, what consequences they had. And we need to be very, very precise about this. I'm not arguing for a looser definition of fascism. Mussolini imprisoned some of his oldest followers because they allegedly were no longer true fascists. Germany, of course, what racial category one belonged to, had potentially fatal consequences. A second thing that historians can do is examine similarities and differences between past and present. They can say how contemporary people who are perhaps of the extreme right or anti-fascist, how did they see fascism? What do they take from it? But I think also that the concern with categorization is sometimes a little dangerous. If history does have a lesson, it's that some of the Nazis' worst crimes were committed by people who did not call themselves fascists. Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men is a good example, for example. In contemporary politics, I think sometimes excessive concern with categorization can provide an alibi. And I just finished with a quote from John Rhys-Evans, for example, of UKIP, who says of his incentives to encourage those with dual nationality to the UK, it's not going to be fascist. I'm not using eugenics or evil things like that. So as long as you don't belong to the category, you can still deport people. Thank you.
Brilliant.
I hate listening to people read things out, but I tend to wander off the point so much that since I've only got about 5 to 7 minutes, I'm going to sort of half read, half look at you, so I apologise for that. My premise, all key terms in political debates are equally problematic, but some are more problematic than others. Fascism is particularly problematic because, as you've pointed out, Kevin, it's commonly used both colloquially and journalistically as an expletive boo word, hate word, to delegitimize a perceived enemy, opponent, family members, in the case of some families, who seem to be displaying authoritarianism or fanaticism. And the very popularity of the term erodes its forensic value for analysis and historical debate. This delegitimizing function has also entered the arena of serious political debates and stands off between politicians and nations, where it's bandied about like a verbal missile. I mean, there's a very serious debate between Russia and Ukraine about which country is the most fascist, for example. Historically, it has a wide variety of specific connotations. The fascist movement and regime led by Mussolini is already complex and momentous enough in European history and can be analysed in many different ways. But once it becomes used as a generic term outside Italy, which it was early on by Marxists for counter-socialist, nationalist, right-wing movements, the problem for academic historians and political analysts has always been to establish and agree what phenomena it applies to and how to characterise their common denominator. It is in the nature of language, and here I totally agree with Kevin, that there can be no definitive solution to this problem. So if you want to leave now. To make things more complicated, Marxists very early on were persuaded that fascism and then generic fascism were products of capitalist reaction, and for decades non-Marxists could not agree at all what fascism meant. While some on the far right were happy to call themselves fascists, but neither Marxists or liberals were interested in how fascists themselves conceptualized what they were. So it was real, what I call the Babel effect, complete proliferation of it as chaos. Thus, for decades, there were deep divisions within academia, and then there's no hope outside from my point of view, over the question whether Nazism or Francoism or the Ustasha or Peronism were fascist, because there was no agreed position unless you were a Marxist, and even there it was complicated. As for post-war neo-fascism, that opens up even bigger cans of worms. Is the Christian fundamentalist right in America, or the Front National, or jihadism, to be seen as fascism? Or fascist. The rise of populism, this buzzword now of the last 15 years, has highlighted the deeply problematic nature of the term, with deep confusion about whether Putinism or Trumpism is fascist or populist and what the relationship between the two is. The alt-right's support for Trump and the hosting of far-right conventions by Putin's Russia makes the whole situation even more tangled. I am here, presumably, because I represent a particular position within that debate. So this is my position. There can be no objective definition of fascism because fascism has no essence. Unlike the problems of taxonomy in the natural life sciences, it is not a real organism to be labelled objectively. It is perfectly legitimate to make up an idiosyncratic definition or refuse to use the term at all. I once read a very good book about the Renaissance that never used the word Renaissance, and I think there's something to be said for that. Just look at the phenomena, but it does pose other problems. This is based on, I represent an increasingly established and conventional school of thought, certainly not hegemonic, there's no such thing, which broadly accepts the premise that fascism can be usefully, and there's the whole thing about heuristically useful, defined by adopting an empathetic but not apologetic approach to definition. What the heck does that mean? It means ask the fascists. I mean, it seems to me very peculiar that whereas other isms you tend to ask what feminists think or anarchists think, fascism has tended to be ignored as something that fascists themselves know how to define. Although I'm not saying that's not problematic. On the basis of actually reading fascists, originally the people who actually called themselves fascists, and they weren't confined to Italy, and working out empirically on the basis of primary sources, I came to the conclusion that, along with a few of my sort of mental buddies in fascist studies, that fascism can be defined as a revolutionary form of ultranationalism which strives for the rebirth of what I've called the ultranation, an organism, obviously only a mythic organism, not necessarily coterminous either with an imagined biological race or with a historic nation state. Approached in this way, populism is to be distinguished from fascism by not pursuing a revolutionary agenda of overthrowing liberal democracy and replacing it with a totalitarian new order based on an organic nation or pure race or homogeneous national culture. Thus, while the alt-right is fascist, the Alternative für Deutschland and Trumpism and the various populist parties in Europe are not fascist in terms of their own political programs, even if some of their electoral supporters and activists are. And I really do think you have to see a big difference between the rhetoric of populism and who actually votes for it, because some of the constituency of the voters may well be to the far right. But I think mainstream populism is not revolutionary, according to the way I've cut up that cake. Ultimately, this is my conclusion, we should not get hung up on terms forged by history which make us too obsessed with classification and devote our intellectual energy and our activistic energy to understanding, analysing and then countering through liberal means the forces of illiberalism and inhumanity, whatever they are called. Crimes against humanity are too often concealed under the cloaks of invisibility offered by political and economic isms, and the job of intellectuals and activists is to redress them with high-vis jackets, and that we should ultimately look beyond all this obsession with definitions to what these various forces like Trump and Putin and all their people in the same sort of category are doing to undermine human values, human rights and liberal democracy. Thank you.
Let me test a proposition that's been made by all the speakers so far. Who here self-identifies as a fascist? Anyone? No candidate? Who would self-identify as a fascist, but they don't want to do it in public? Who identifies themselves as an anti-fascist? Oh, well, yes, that's good. Yes, that's interesting. Okay. I mean, I leave that on the table, so to speak, for us to think about. In other words, that for some people, identification as anti-fascist is important. For other people, even though they're not fascist, they don't want to necessarily identify as anti-fascist. Now, this question, this sort of more or less consensus over the fact that nobody identifies as fascism raises the question of whether we can have an uncomfortable debate about it, since nobody is going to appear on the other side, right? This is not one of those sessions. I'm sure in the sessions on conservatism and liberalism, you could have a ding-dong between different points of view, and it's going to be hard to have that here. I think if we had been holding this panel before 1989, we could have had a ding-dong, certainly among us, and it would have been easily reflected in the audience, because the theories of fascism were so antagonistic at that time. I mean, there's been some allusion to Marxist theories, and that would have been one of the major dividing lines between people who different historians or different political scientists who studied this field. But that has actually, more or less dissipated, and you have a remarkable consistency, I think, from what we're all going to say. You could already have seen that there are overlaps in the previous two speakers, and nothing that I'm going to say, I think, really disturbs the sense that there's a consensus, which in some ways is a consensus of helplessness, because we've lost the ability, I think, to hold on to, let me put this incautiously, ideological definitions of other ideologies. And I think there's also another problem for those of us who study this subject, which is that we don't study fascism in order to rectify it or to improve it or to make it work better, which we might do if we were students of socialism or conservatism or liberalism. We're always on the outside of it. And I think that's a point that Roger was addressing when he talks about an empathetic understanding. It's a very interesting question. It might be one that people will want to debate, how you reach empathy without, so to speak, identification or sympathy. Now, I think the arguments, therefore, among academics have been not about the thing itself, but about explanations of fascism. And I think there are two, if one's just talking about analytic approaches, I would distinguish between two approaches each of which we've seen deployed here. One is the question of what is the ideological content of fascism, define what it is, and I think you've got some sense that a lot of students of fascism are very nervous about doing that, or don't think it's necessarily the best way to go about the issue. The other question is to situate it historically, to investigate what determines a fascist movement, or a fascist epoch, a fascist era, or a fascist movement, and what, at the risk of sounding functionalist, what fascism does. From my point of view, thinking historically, the best term I can come up with, thinking of, and I'm going to say a little more about both of those approaches in a moment, but the best term I can come up with what we can offer is to think about the way in which we understand or have studied fascism in the past. Does it give us clues? Does it give us ideas and concepts that are good to think with for the present? And that idea of something being good to think with, it's a very standard idea, comes originally from anthropology, but I think it's quite a useful stance to take, because it gets you away, I think, from the labelling, from saying this isn't, you defer that a bit and think about the questions that face you as questions of analysis. Now, what I would say, trying to link these two together, the ideology and what fascism is determined by and what it does, I would say that I would put at the centre of my definitions today the issue of race, sexual politics and subjectivity. And I think for the following reasons, that if we think about the era of original fascism as being in the interwar period, okay, maybe my colleagues will debate that, I think that race represented an unspoken fly in the ointment of a 19th century narrative of progress, a 19th century narrative that was hegemonic until the First World War and the Bolshevik Revolution massively disrupted that, okay? But already hidden inside that 19th century narrative of peace and progress was the question of the repression of a narrative of colonial racism, which erupted after the First World War, even before it, into the centre of European politics and society. And perhaps I should backtrack a moment and say that my working model for fascism, or at least for trying to think about it, is to see it as a temporally successful but enormously costly way of rethinking or remaking fundamental questions about the relationship between state and society after the First World War and after the Bolshevik Revolution. And as I say, those were the massive eruptions into a hegemonic 19th century narrative, I mean, with all the equivocations and qualifications that you can make. And I think that throws, as I've just tried to suggest, race to the centre of European political discourse again. And I think the same is true for feminism, or for sexual politics more widely, that the emancipation and enfranchisement of women before, during and after the First World War were body blows to a normative masculine order which fascists aspired to restore, so that internally the fascist state is a hyper-masculinized entity. It's a community of brothers in arms, and its gendered other is no longer society, in 1 minute, but an atrophied arena which has reduced the narrowest conception of the domestic and the reproductive. The sexual politics of fascism, I think, depend upon an absolute atrophy of what stands against this masculine identity. And the exclusion of women from this public sphere is doubly intensified through the reconceptualization of the public sphere as an agonistic sphere of struggle, of battle, and of death. Now that has a huge implication, I think, for how you understand the other generally. Both the racial model and the model from gender present models of the other which are antithetical to the fascist vision of unity, homogeneity, of closed, national, coercive, and autarkic models of political community. And that sense of self, which repudiates the sense of the other, I think is integral to the concept of the fascist self. And actually, just to throw out one completely sort of off-the-wall remark at this point, this sense of not being, of seeing everything outside yourself, everything outside the will, 20 seconds, as a threat, as something that you can't meet with openness. You have to meet it with resistance, with defence. In some ways, this is exactly the archetype of Trump's character. And it's why I describe Trump as a fascist without fascism, because he's got that essential kind of closeness an absolute repudiation of everything different, which for me is one of the core characteristics of historical fascist thought and action.
I want to start with the words of Archbishop Justin Welby. I'm quoting him. "There are 1,000 ways to explain the Brexit vote in a nationalist, populist, or even fascist tradition of politics." So let's just leave that quote to sit there. Fascism is not on the political menu today in the literal sense, or a rerun of Germany in 1933 or Italy in 1922. The very specific historical character of those moments, the upheavals that you alluded to. But in another way, fascism and the powerful myths that surround it dominate the contemporary agenda and pose, I would argue, new risks to democracy and freedom today. So many of Europe's elites in the 1920s and the 1930s, explored in John Carey's book, for example, were anti-democratic and anti-masses, and that prejudice helped push fascists into power. Today's elites manifest their anti-democratic prejudices through the prism of anti-fascism. The old fascism was defined against democracy as a threat to civilization, nation and race. Nazis argued that people weren't motivated by rationality in politics, making democracy, liberal democracy, a lie, but by darker, more real, irrational forces. Today's elites warn that democracy is threatening because of a predilection for fascism among the masses. It used to be the French terror and the Bolshevik terror, now it's fascism. Myths surrounding the rise to power of fascists have given rise itself to a political order, especially the supranational European Union, that is premised on the idea that untrammeled public politics leads to Nazism and war. The great myth is that popular passions unleashed by upheavals, economic crisis and national electorates lead to the rise of aggressive state nationalism unless they are placed under some kind of supranational political restraint. In this account of history, it was unrestrained popular politics, moved by dark passions cut loose by economic crisis and demagogues, that swept the fascists and Nazis to power in the 20s and the 30s. In this worldview, the role of the EU, for example, and other institutions of political order exist to calm and restrain the political passions of the European populace. This pessimistic outlook actually has intellectual roots in the fascist era. It was right-wing and conservative thinkers, such as a card-carrying Nazi Carl Schmitt, who regarded war as imminent in politics. Schmitt argued that societies, especially in the realm of international relations, were defined by a friend-enemy state of political nature. Liberal democracy and the debates surrounding representative parliaments were, for Schmitt, an artificial veneer covering the more violent, imminent reality of political conflict. So in his 1932 book, The Concept of the Political, he wrote, "War is neither the aim, nor the purpose, nor even the very content of politics, but as an ever-present possibility, it is the leading presupposition which determines in a characteristic way human action and thinking, and thereby creates a specifically political behaviour." This new type of political theory gave rise to a liberal approach to political practice, to dump liberal democracy, which is based on rational and conscious decision-making, to new structures and new institutions that would represent and embody these darker and more, well, maybe not darker, but these more irrational given. And this view of people is very much mirrored in contemporary prejudices. Politics increasingly today, or very much today, is not seen as a rationality of autonomous individuals pursuing conscious interests, but based much more on the idea that humans are motivated by deeper irrational identification with certain political or racial groupings, for example. Arendt noted in The Origins of Totalitarianism that Nazis like Schmitt, quote, presented arguments as invariably originating in deep natural, social, or psychological sources beyond the control of the individual and therefore beyond the power of reason. If a true motives for people are beyond the power of reason, well, liberal democracy is just a lie, it's a joke, it's less than a veneer. The historical record shows, of course, that it is a myth that fascist dictators, Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini, came to power because they were swept there by popular and overwhelming majorities. When he assumed power in 1933, Hitler's electoral success was actually waning, he never had a majority, and his Nazi party was splitting before he was saved by his alliance with von Papen, a traditional conservative. Hitler was in fact saved because the German political class and state accepted the kind of pessimism, Schmitt's pessimism, that politics was a fight to the death and saw Hitler as its champion. The prejudice that popular passions give rise to fascism almost as a state of nature assigns a role to political institutions in constraining politics, whether at the level of national sovereignty and self-determination or freedom, especially of free speech. So essentially, the history of fascism, its specificity, its complexity, the difficulties to define it, is twisted and misrepresented to become a simple morality play on the perils of majoritarian politics and the latent irrational xenophobia of voters. So we see constantly this idea that free speech must be constrained to ensure that the Hitler-loving worst of people is not unleashed. So essentially my argument is today fascism is not a problem, but the illiberal cult of fascism and a corresponding anti-fascism is.
I'm going to come to you individually if there's anything you want to come back on. I really find it very interesting that both Roger and Kevin, you talked about this idea of whether we should be asking fascists what fascism really means. So kind of wonder that, seeing as there aren't any fascists in the audience, and I couldn't really find many fascists to join us on the panel. Does that mean
waiting outside,
does that mean if there aren't really that many self-identifying fascists, maybe we're not seeing a resurgence of fascism? Kevin, do you have any?
Well, I totally agree. We need to listen to what fascists say, as long as we listen to all of them and don't have a kind of definition which says that those who don't agree with our definition are not relevant. Right. And that is sometimes the danger, I think. And I think that Roger actually has helped us. Really, I think that when your book first came out, it did encourage people to properly listen to what fascists were saying. And my reservation. I mean, Roger and I have sparred over these things for many years, I guess.
Don't stop now.
Roger,
anything to pick up on?
Just to sort of reiterate, I actually think that one of the great tragedies of the interwar period is that if you like, the cognitive or mythic content of fascist worldview, I wouldn't call it rational, but it's rationalized through language like all worldviews, was massively underestimated by ruling elites in the interwar period. I mean, I want to put it in a journalistic way, with all apologies to journalism, but if actually Mein Kampf had been studied as much as Das Kapital, then maybe the intentionality or the programs, the strategies of Nazism would have been understood in a way which, some people have argued that appeasement actually allowed us to rearm so that we could win the war, and that's another sort of counterfactual thing. But I do think that people have systematically underestimated the power of the irrational, and also the fact that you can have, and you've quoted one of them, Schmitt, intellectual, a high degree of intellectual irrationalism. There are some of the most fascinating thinkers and writers in the vanguard of thought in the interwar period and post-war in different ways. People like Alain de Benoit of the New Right, Alexander Dugin in Russia, who's massively he's just almost invisible in the West, but he's incredibly important for Putin's concept of Russian Eurasian mission. These people should be studied and read and understood, and we should not create this idea that only liberals and certain favoured people on the left have a monopoly of reason and strategy and intellectuality. And I think we massively underestimate, as a liberal elite, the power of the irrational and the need of irrational intellectuals to actually promote ideas. And so to that extent, I think whatever we call them, we should need a far more intellectual culture where we can map all these various battles of ideas going on. We tend to be sort of rather blind in the right eye from that point of view.
Jane, any views?
Yes, I just want to say a couple of things. I think it's that you're being a little unfair to Carl Schmitt. I'm no follower of him, and he may not be a concept to anybody, to most people, because he's a rather esoteric writer. But I think actually, and I think this is the important point, is not whether you know Schmitt or not, but whether you have some sense of the difference between John Locke's concepts of how you understand political society and Thomas Hobbes's.
Can I briefly explain?
Yeah, I'm just going to say that. So, on Thomas Hobbes, because Locke is, if you like, these are both 17th century political theorists writing in very, very different circumstances. And Hobbes, writing in and in the aftermath of the English Civil War, is horrified by the possibility of the breakdown of anarchy, of the breakdown of sovereignty, and therefore develops a political theory in which sovereignty and the willingness to obey, I mean, this is putting it very crudely, is absolutely crucial. And that's what Schmitt picks up on, is the necessity for a kind of unified centre which becomes the bulwark of that particular society or country. The Lockean view is basically what we live with. It's a kind of, they're both contract views of society, but Locke's view of contract is that it's kind of shared, put it that way. It's not between us and the all-powerful sovereign, but among ourselves, okay? I mean, this is a very crude way of putting it, because Hobbes also thinks that we collectively contract among ourselves and then give that power over to the sovereign. Locke has a more kind of open view of it, and that, I think, is the difference that's been got at here. On this question of taking fascists seriously or debating seriously, I think one reason why people didn't politically in the interwar period, and actually maybe this is true after the period too, but given the dominant model of what an ideology was, there was a strong view that fascism had no ideology. It just had prejudices, a bundle of ragbag ideas and so on. And this is the context in which I was taught as a student, that there isn't such a thing as fascist ideology. It took a long time for that to be broken down, and for the kind of attempt to do understanding without identification that my fellow panelists have talked about, for that to become part of just how we tried to study the subject.
Brilliant. Bruno?
I think that Roger's point and why his books are so good, Modernism and Fascism, read it, is going back to primary sources, because it's really, I found it very surprising to go back and actually read these people, even people like Rosenberg, completely insane, vicious and nasty, but curiously compelling, and some of the overlap between what he was usually ranting about and some of the contemporary prejudices around a very striking Mussolini, a fantastic writer, I mean, a great polemicist, a writer and a great polemicizer against the liberal order, and he shared many of the views and contempt for the liberal order that were shared by liberals, or like Thomas Mann, who wanted a new Kaiser. Joseph Schumpeter, who called himself a Marxist, who thought that individuals were essentially irrational, so therefore you could not have a rational parliament if it was based on. And yeah, exactly. So his prejudices were pretty interesting. Schmitt is really interesting. I think your definitions are fair enough. I mean, Schmitt is really interesting because he's essentially a jurist. He's a jurist who was authoritarian, became a Nazi for a while, dropped out of political public life after the Second World War. His book on dictatorship is absolutely fascinating because it's a constitutional, legal, democratic defence argument, essentially, at root for dictatorship. It has real resonances today, given people's concerns. So Schmitt is very, very important again, and he's very widely read. Actually, people don't boast about it, but in international relations, all diplomats read the concepts of the political. Okay, so going back to primary sources is really, really important to understand what was specific about fascism and fascists in its day, and also to realise how they were radical and they had radical departures, but how essentially they built on very, very strong existing prejudices that existed across the board of political thought, one of which at that time was the idea that essentially people are irrational.
Those of you put your hands up when Jane asked if you had any anti-fascists. Bruno's come along and said that perhaps it's the anti-fascists who might be slightly intolerant. Jane herself has mentioned, Trump's a fascist without fascism. So, you don't need to get bogged down in technicalities.
If you read a detailed history, and there are some available, of Italian fascism, it's quite clear that the root of it is Marxism. I mean, Mussolini was the editor of the Italian Socialist Party's newspaper. His concern was, during the First World War, there's not much point looking to international solidarity and international proletariat when you're in a war. Clearly, you need to identify first with your own national proletariat. That, basically, in a nutshell, is what Italian fascism is. Everything else really is detail. Now, this is a problem across. This was largely echoed in Germany. Obviously, Germany's got its own specific racism thing. There was no racist element in Italy at all. Then you got Stalin, who famously quoted his policies in a nutshell is socialism in one country. National socialism, that's what it was. The BNP were a National Socialist Party. The left are just closing ranks. They've always denied this, but that's what it is.
None of us here are fascists, but at the same time, we have to admit that we are, after all, the product of probably thousands of generations of sometimes fascist behavior. And so my question is, to what extent is that true? To what extent are we actually fascists? Is that our sort of natural state? And to what extent are we in denial of that? And if we are in denial of that, can we overcome that natural fascist state?
I want to know your angle on something I've been thinking about to do with symbols. Why is it that a swastika is immediately identifiable as a murderous and pathological symbol, but the hammer and sickle isn't? Is it just historical ignorance? I think there's more to it, though.
A lot of the talk is kind of about fascists in the past, interwar, pre-war Italians. But is there such thing as a current, modern fascist? People call Donald Trump a fascist. People argue he isn't a fascist. Is there such thing as a neo-fascist? And if so, where is it in the world?
I kind of think that any discussion of fascism post-1945 has got an unnecessarily surreal or rhetorical character, because to be a fascist in the formation, to recruit and join a fascist movement before it's been tested in time is in my judgment, seems a bit crazy, but at least we know, they would have not seen where it's come from. Whereas anybody who's a fascist after 1945 is in some other kind of realm of eccentricity, and I just think it's a kind of a useless category for describing any kind of a thing post 1945. It doesn't mean to say that there aren't certain affinities of illiberal thought or racist thought. I mean, these are all current and strong within all kinds of political movements after, conservative, liberal, socialist even. But to say, I think the fascist label is really one that we should just put to bed, because it's just too bad in terms of political rhetoric. So even if I don't like Donald Trump, which I don't, and I think he's kind of crazy and racist and all these things, I just think that the minute I say you fascist, that really I might as well just leave the room, because I've just become like me screaming at my dad, and it's got no actual purchase on reality, because the category is too, it's been broken apart by over-rhetoricization.
For me, as in so many of these sessions, by listening, you realise that the question that's been asked is not quite the question that you really want to have answered. So what is fascism doesn't, to me, and this is a naked attempt to change the subject of the discussion, and I'm sure the room will...
Be careful.
The question is not really what is fascism. There are two questions. One is, what was fascism? And then the second question, which I think is the more interesting one, which is, what in the modern day, when you have liberal democracies under pressure in the same way, to some extent, that they were under pressure in the 20s and 30s, what happens to politics, and what can we learn from what happened under fascism in the 20s and 30s to what applies today? That's the question I'm interested in.
Bruno, do you want to pick up on just one of those points?
I think the really important thing is not to embrace the prejudices about what makes people tick, the prejudice that people are irrational, the prejudice that if you unleash popular passions it will end in the French guillotine or the Holocaust. Mussolini made a really good point in 1932 where he basically wrote that no one was defending democracy anymore, even the liberals had given up on democracy. So really, I guess a point of my introduction was basically that point, is at the moment a lot of people have given up on democracy. We've seen it in response to events in this country recently, and that is, for me, problematic. It's not fascism, but it's problematic. And I think the lesson we learned from the 20s and the 30s is elites and states gave up on democracy. Hitler passed the Enabling Act because he was supported by all the non-socialist parties in the Reichstag. He didn't even, in March 1933, with state of emergency powers and a state of terror on the streets of Germany, managed to get a majority. So don't give up on democracy is the lesson.
Brilliant. Jane?
I have to say that in anything that I've written about this, I have been very wary about applying fascist labels. And my throwaway remark at the end about saying that Trump was a fascist because he has what I think of as aspects of the fascist personality in a sort of, that he represents this absolute kind of closure to any possible openness. I mean, the man cannot deal with openness. He's like a kind of, a walking incarnation in that sense. But it was a throwaway remark, and it wasn't intended to be a statement about the character of American right-wing politics now. But in fact, what I was trying to do was precisely in some sense to answer the question that you posed. In other words, to say what was fascism in the past, and thinking about what it was, what can we learn about it for the present? And I think I had to rather race through, because I was running out of time. I had to race through my point that I think that the issue for me that's most sort of germane about fascism in the interwar period is that it's fundamentally about trying to think in a period of huge political, economic and constitutional upheaval, what is the relationship between citizen and state? How should we understand the relationship between state and society? What is citizenship? What forms of political engagement and political representation do vary? And the fascists are not the only group that are thinking about this, but they're a group which I think are really grappling with those questions, which are being dealt with in all kinds of other. Think of all the constitutions that were being written in 1918 and 1919. Think of the emancipation, the enfranchisement of women, and so on and so forth. Think about the whole question about, the limitations of political citizenship, which rumble on in this country, continue on to post-Second World War or World War II, thinking about what social citizenship might be, and so on. And I think now, that's what we have to think about now, is really, these are drawing attention to issues about, which we've been discussing here, which is how what kind of politics and what kind of political representation are appropriate in a period where a lot of the institutional supports that accompanied the recovery of democratic government across Europe in the post-Second World War period have been whittled away, have been weakened, appear to be inadequate, whatever. I'm not giving agency to them, but they do not seem to be working in that sense. And that space has been opened up, and that's what we should be looking at. And that's where potentially looking at the past could help us just define what the problems are.
Brilliant. Roger?
I can't answer all those fascinating questions, but what I would like to suggest is that one view, and only one view, of the history of humanity could be of a almost Manichaean, that means eternal conflict, struggle, between two potentials within human nature. And here I'm trying to address the idea of an eternal fascist, what Woody Allen calls in Ants the inner maggot. And that there is an obvious extraordinary capacity that human beings have for transcultural humanism, for living in contact with other human beings and being cooperative and all that sort of stuff. And that's a real potential. It's in our genes and everything. There's another horrific potential for destroying the other and demonizing and all that. And I think that story is going on, and it's going on, and it's got extremely critical now. It's tied up with ecological destruction and new forms of imperialism and new forms of colonization and slavery. Now, in a way, from that perspective, fascism was one particular form that a particular form of xenophobia and demonization of others took in a particular phase. I would like to think that it's possible for journalists and people in debates to spend a bit more time looking at what happened in the interwar period and actually realise that the dangers to democracy now are liberal democracy based on real human global potential for love and all that sort of hippie stuff are actually complex. There is, for me, the most frightening form of perversion is populism, because populism is far more insidious than neo-fascism. I mean, the sort of neo-Nazis that supported Alternative for Germany in a pop concert this summer, you can identify them. They like being identified. They wear swastikas. It's got it all. But the far more insidious is, say, Putin's contamination or Trump's contamination of liberal democracy, because it's precisely not fascist, and because it wears the clothes of liberal democracy and appeals to things which, of course, we all agree with, which is a sense of place, right to an identity, blah, blah, blah. So I would say that basically we can learn from debates like this, etc., just to get a little bit more interested in fine-tuning the concepts we use, but not get obsessed with the concepts, and really try to look at the uniqueness of what's going on, but try to place it in a wider historical context. And that context can go way into the history of savagery and oppression, way before the modern age.
Just one. I don't know. What about fascism and the left? I guess if I understood the first question properly, it's saying that fascism is a kind of revision of Marxism, or fascism is Marxism, I think was the question. Well, I personally have no problem with recognising the contribution of people who came from the left and took left-wing ideas and revised them and incorporated them into fascism. But what I would say is that the problem again is when you say that's what fascism is and saying the rest is details. But in fact, what I would say is that it's worth emphasising the eclecticism of what becomes fascism, because fascism took stuff from all over the political spectrum, from liberal ideas of competition and Darwinistic competition, which influenced liberalism as much as fascism, and took also basically, really, I think that you name an ideology, you can find some kind of precedent for fascism in it. And what that kind of underlines is that the passage into different ideologies is possible for pretty much anyone, actually.
As somebody who identified as an anti-fascist, as somebody who's made myself very unpopular when I was a student for saying that Enoch Poll had the right to come to Bradford University and speak. On the day that I got married to my current wife, my father-in-law said to me, as we were standing there in my front room with top hat and tails on, said, Derek, you have to bear in mind I used to be a Liberal Democrat politician, said, Derek, you ought to know I used to be a fascist. And he had been. He was a member of the New Party. He had been a warm-up speaker as a young man for Oswald Mosley in Birmingham, which is where he's from. And I knew him as a Liberal Tory in his later years. And for me, the fascination that there is about leaving aside political movements and all that sort of stuff and political philosophies that you've talked about is how individuals come to the place where they come to that identifies at a particular moment in time with that. Now, fortunately, Morris left for his family an autobiography which explained how he became to be a fascist. But it is quite interesting that he did that, and it was far more about disruption of family. It was far more about a weak father than it was about almost anything else that was about political philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I actually would like an attempt to answer the question of what is fascism. I mean, that is why I came here, to try at least have a tentative definition. And I do take the point that there are limits to a definitional approach. You can't kind of capture the entire story in a simple definition. But from what's been said by different people, you know, we've got the inner maggot, so-called, of, you know, what's inside humanity. We've got Putin, we've got populism, we've got Marxism, we've got all sorts of things being thrown around. So to my mind, it would be useful to have a tentative definition. I mean, one thing I'd like to throw out, but, you know, I could well be wrong, I'm no expert in this area, but how about the fact that if you look at fascist movements in the interwar period, I mean, one thing that distinguished them from, you know, far right-wing ideas was they did seem to have, that they were ready to use physical force. You know, they had black shirts or brown shirts or militias, and they were actually willing to use physical force to physically smash up their opponents. I mean, is that something which is a defining character of fascism, perhaps something else. But I would like to hear the answer from the panel.
I don't know if anybody else is feeling a little frustrated with the historians on the panel, the way I am. But it basically comes down to this. Your opening comments were really about trying to not define what fascism is and how difficult it is. But you are increasingly convinced that it's populism. You are talking about the being closed off and demonisation of others, but then you are also very sure that there is some populist demon lurking around. That's very frustrating. Can you please, define your terms and just be straight about what you think a fascist is,
Brilliant. Okay, I'm actually going to bring the panel back. If you could, I'm going to push you for a definition, a tentative definition of fascism.
Well, you can boo as much as you like, but fascism has been many different things to many different people.
What is it to you?
Well, what is it to me? The thing is that I think what we need to distinguish between is what people have said fascism was and what its consequences were, and what we now find morally right and wrong. And modern politics are actually a question of morality.
Most dictionaries
No, okay.
Yeah, well, most.
No, Kevin, can you continue?
I can give you a long list of what people have said fascism was, what fascists have said what fascist was, and they are often contradictory. And I can go no further than that. And when I'm talking about the past, I can be pretty sure about what I think is right or wrong in the present. But what fascism really was in the past has no bearing on what I think is right or wrong now.
Roger, then Bruno. I mean,
well,
definitions.
Can I say you must have battle fatigue, and I must read badly because I offered you a definition. Can I just repeat? There is no objective definition of anything whatsoever. If you, that's another thing, right? There is within the Marxist camp, which is very, very big and wide, and it's not a single definition. There is a very clear line of argument about it being something to do with capitalism in a particular state of crisis. I made my reputation, I'm still got a job, because I came out with a definition which actually wasn't original, but it tidied it up. I can give you a single sentence definition. It's not true, because there are no true definitions, but a lot of people have found it quite useful and illuminating. And what it stresses, for the purposes of research and writing students and running courses and distinguishing it from populism, which I have not demonised, I just said it's a threat to liberalism, some people don't like liberalism, is that it's a revolutionary form of nationalism. Therefore, it is different from Trump. If Trump came in and said, I want to get rid of the American Constitution and wipe out elections and blah, 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 that, for me, would push him into the camp of revolutionary nationalism. But he's populist precisely because he's on the cusp. He's supported by some fascists, but he is within the Constitution, and therefore it's populism which is the danger now compared with the fascism of the interwar period. So don't say nobody offered you a definition. It just got a bit buried in all the compost here. Okay?
Look, fascism was radical. Its radicalism is really, really important. What it really had in its sights was liberal democracy, the order surrounding liberal and democracy, and because they saw politics as being constituted on a different basis, irrational, motivated by deeper, darker forces, hence the violence, and they wanted to use the reconstitution of politics around irrationalism to essentially re-engineer the relationship between the state and the individual, and they had varying degrees of success there. And that takes you on to another debate, which Arendt explores in the origins of totalitarianism, is to look what happened in Stalinist Russia, but in Nazi Germany as well, when that relationship between the state and the individual started to be re-engineered and its destructive consequences.
Jane, very quickly.
Well, very quickly, I'm going to give you the definition of the spokesman for the Communist Party in the German Reichstag in 1922-23, Clara Zetkin, who said that fascism is the punishment of the proletariat for not taking the revolutionary road. In other words, if the proletariat had risen up in revolution successfully, which of course was the big issue in Germany just shortly before that, fascism would have had no success, and that as a movement, historically speaking, it was, as it were, their problem and their fault. And it's a counter to the threat of Bolshevism, which had not been successful.
Brilliant. Okay, so we're going to come up for one last round. We're going to be really, really quick now, okay?
The last two speakers, I think, got a bit closer. I do think the first two speakers on this are just wishy-washy. Wikipedia says fascism is a form of radical authoritarian nationalism characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition and control of industry and commerce that came to prominence in the early 20th century Europe. I think if we try to keep fascism as a moment in history and try to understand it as a moment in history, rather than a catch-all term that really explains nothing, I think we'd get much closer to the truth. Fascism in history...
Very quickly, Wendy.
And we should understand it as history, and start thinking about new language for what's going on now, which is scary in many, many different ways. I don't think populism is scary. I think aspects of populism is scary. Okay. So, for example, one of the kinds of populism I find scary are things that a lot of left-wing peoples do.
Christopher Clark, in his work Iron Kingdom, claimed that the rise of Nazism and fascism in Germany was due to its Prussian history, and Hitler was an exemplification and the final incarnation of its history of militarism and collectivism. Can one view and predict the rise of fascism or ultranationalism in a state via its history and not just through current events? And is it inevitable that fascism can rise because of a state's history? Thank you.
Great question. Yes.
All right. I just wanted to say one thing to Professor Griffin, because I think you weren't quite right when you said that you could find the far right within the AfD, because actually far right symbols are highly forbidden in Germany. There's a very strict clampdown on anybody who shows any fascist symbols. So the thing we've got is a very kind of paradox situation in which people actually might be rebelling against authority, against an official anti-fascist authority, by displaying fascist symbols. That shows how complicated and how difficult it is, and how wrong you might be in sort of pinpointing fascism, by saying these are the same fascists as in the 1930s, where it was quite a different matter.
I was watching a podcast the other day, and the name of it was Fascist Fashion. And I think it's not actually fashion, don't worry. But I think that this whole idea that fascists just sort of died out or like crawled underground and live in caves somewhere is just it's not correct, because in online communities, and which makes sense, seeing as today when asked if anyone identified as fascist, no one put their hand up. There are a lot of people who do identify as fascists, but they're not the type of people you see like stabbing someone in the street or like even doing like a Nazi salute. They're weak. They're genuinely laughable. Than you like. I think to call them neo-fascists would be like even a stretch, because they're just so pathetic and reactionary now, but they do exist. They are still around.
Right, I'm going to come back to the panel for just 2 minutes, final comments. Kevin, 2 minutes of thoughts.
2 minutes, ooh. Well, what would I say in 2 minutes? Well, on the question of definition, what I think about, I am a historian above all, and one of the things I've learned about history is that you can never... we're very attached to the idea that words must have a single meaning. Sadly, they don't. Your definition of fascism will not be the same as somebody else's. Historians have never agreed on one. Ordinary people have never agreed on one. Members of political parties don't agree what their party means. The outcome of what happens in history is debates, is the result of arguments about what things mean often, and disputes and conflicts. Now, in those debates, what we have to do as academics is one thing. We have to trace those debates and their consequences. But if we're acting in daily politics, we do something different, which is we think, what do we stand for? What do we believe is right? What do we believe is wrong? I think, for example, that racism is wrong. I look around and I think what I think is racism, and I stand up for that. There will be disputes, of course, about who's a racist and who's not. one of the things about modern politics is precisely disputes about what counts as racism. And one of the things that, say, for example, the New Right was to redefine racism and say, well, we stand for the equality of races rather than the inequality of races, which Adolf Hitler did. So we need to be what I'm saying really is that if we cannot think that words have one meanings, we need to think about what words actually mean in the context and what their consequences are and what reach they might have. And a good example is a famous case of a libel of somebody who was in court for using racially abusive language, a footballer, and his defence effectively was that he didn't belong to the category of racist, therefore he was innocent. He may have said what he said, but he got evidence to prove that he wasn't a racist. But I think that you need to think about the consequence of using the term, and to me, that was a false defence.
Brilliant. Cheers, Kevin. Roger.
One of the drivers of interwar fascism was a nostalgia for a community, a homogeneous community of people who are all unified by the same vision and the same goal and the same analysis of what was wrong with society, and the imposition of a discourse under Nazism and fascism which made a lot of people feel really comfortable. Being exposed to massive misunderstanding by almost everybody who's asked a question today and saying things I haven't said, etc., I can understand the nostalgia for a sort of homogeneous thought. On the other hand, I celebrate and I love the fact that I'm living in such an atomized and pluralistic society that I can sit here and spout off and be denigrated, etc. And it really doesn't matter because it's the absolute plurality of the sort of society that I'm living in, which I love and allows me intellectual freedom and means that I can do lectures at Oxford Brookes and not without fear of the Gestapo coming in. And I would say that there is a very, very real threat to the understanding that what makes this possible historically is a celebration of difference and a celebration of tolerance, a really deep tolerance, which means that even if somebody parodies my ideas or I walk out in a minute and find a obscene cartoon of me, it doesn't matter. That we do not resort to violence and slogans in order to reduce the complexity of the world and the infinite chaos of our inner selves to some sort of marching simulacrum of a human being. So even though I come out of this battle slightly scarred, I'm glad that it's been a verbal battle and not a physical one.
Hear, hear.
Very good. I just want to pick up on the point that was made about Prussianism and Hitler, not to address that specifically, but just to paraphrase the old saw about history, that history is one damn thing before another. And that's what historians do, is that you do have to go back into the past. And what is so important is to try to figure out, just as I might try to isolate, as I tried to do in my initial remarks, some aspects of what I think of as integral to fascism, and let's think about those and where they are, and let's think about where they are now in relation to political movements or political currents now. So in terms of looking at a country's past, you have to kind of be, the trick is to get the most important, the salient issues, and to figure out what is the trajectory that you want to run them between because you've got the whole of the past. I mean, it's a vast lake in which anyone can fish. And as far as explaining National Socialism is concerned, there were schools of thought which went right back to the Romans and to the defeat of Hammond and Cheruscan and so on. Graven on the minds of everyone who studied this history in the 1960s and 1970s. But so thinking about the past and about which bits of the historical past you think are salient to understand a country's present is very, very important, and that will change. It's a shifting target. It's not going to be. It's not going to remain the same. And the other thing I think which is very important is to think about the way in which movements or ideologies or whatever it is we're talking about now and in the past are in some respects, they are extrapolations from, if not perversions of, integral things to that society. So that the point of Trump, just my last 15 seconds, that behind Trump is big capital in various incarnations, and that is also behind or integrated into the American political system. I don't mean that conspiratorially. I just mean that the relationship between economic power and political power is very risky and very dodgy in America. I mean here too, but specifically under the current situation in the States.
Thank you, Jane. Bruno, 2 minutes.
It's very important. Roger's point is really important that populists do not want to overthrow democracy. Fascists were the most radical proponents in terms of their practice and their whole concept of the political for overthrowing democracy and rebuilding the individual in their image of the world. Most populists want to restore some kind of civic nationalism. They perceive often with great force that democratic accountability has been eroded. Whole areas of politics in the Eurozone, for example, have been put above and beyond politics. So they have a lot of force to their arguments in many ways. A lot of them argue they want to renew democracy, not to overthrow it. They're much more in a liberal tradition on the whole certainly than fascists. It's really important to remember that institutions did not save Germany particularly from fascism. They had a democratic defence, they had a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag that proved to no avail because institutions bought into the idea that democracy had to be overthrown to protect order, because actually people were very much cast as the fascists presented them. So I think the really important thing is to retain trust in people. Retain trust in people, because that is what constitutes the democratic order. As soon as you introduce mistrust, as soon as you introduce ideologies of mistrust, then you erode that. So I think, on optimism and pessimism, you need to retain that optimistic sense that is a reality, a historical reality, that human beings are constructive. They are not irrational creatures who are driven by passions and dark irrational impulses.